In the last episode, we ended with a hard question. Not whether your strategy is sophisticated enough, but whether the conditions for judging strategy were ever present in the first place. We argued that once planning can no longer act as a proxy, strategy has to be understood as judgment under irreducible uncertainty. And that is where renewal either becomes possible or fails silently. This episode is where we make that concrete. We're going to stay with that idea of judgment under uncertainty, but move from diagnosis to design, from why strategy breaks and why CFOs hold the consequences, to how governance can be redesigned so good judgment becomes ordinary, not heroic. If episode 1 showed where strategy actually breaks, and episode 2 reframed strategy as judgment, this final episode is about the system around you, the architecture, the signals, the ledger, and the pulse that either shuts judgment down or allows it to keep working as the world shifts. My name is Paul Hunter. Welcome. One of the most deeply embedded ideas in modern strategy is the distinction between long-term and short-term. It sounds reasonable, even necessary. Long-term strategy, short-term execution, quarterly guidance, 10-year plans. Every board pack you have ever reviewed has those horizons built in. But underneath that language sits an assumption that no longer holds. That is the assumption that the future can be stabilised long enough to plan against it. That if you pick the right horizon and run the right process, you can lock in a direction and then simply execute. In reality, strategy rarely fails because organisations lack foresight. Most of us are drowning in foresight. You have scenarios, dashboards, risk registers, regulatory outlooks, and market intelligence. The problem is not that you can't see enough. The problem is that you are pressured to decide too early and then defend the decision long after its assumptions start to slip. Strategy fails because organisations commit too early to a particular version of the future and then build governance around defending that choice. The problem is not the length of the plan, it is the belief that strategy can be fixed in time at all. You can have a very long-term plan built on assumptions that are already obsolete. You can have a very short-term plan that is precisely judged and keeps your options open. What matters, though, is something more exact. Strategy is not defined by time horizons, it is defined by whether its assumptions remain coherent as conditions change. In that sense, strategy is not something you execute over time. It is something you continually reassess under conditions of extreme, sometimes even in moderate levels of uncertainty. And that changes the role of leadership, especially the role of the CFO. It shifts strategy away from planning and towards judgment, away from fixed direction and towards continual renewal. Because the real test of strategy is not whether it endures, but whether it remains coherent as the world around it shifts. Take the electric energy transition industry, for example. You can see this clearly in the process of transition. Think about a large generation and network business. 10 years ago, it approved major assets on the assumption that demand, regulation, and technology would move gradually. The intelligence on transition risk was already there. What failed was not foresight. It was judgment and pressure. Capital was committed into assets based on assumptions that did not hold long enough. By the time the world shifted, the organisation had already consumed most of its flexibility. From the CFO side of the table, the real problem was not stranded assets. It was stranded flexibility. The organisation could, in theory, change, but only at enormous financial and political cost. Governance had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had protected the plan. It had turned assumptions into obligations. There was no authorised way to revisit those assumptions without destabilising the system itself. The organisation wasn't short of intelligence. it was short of a system that allowed judgment to remain active after commitment. If we take that seriously, governance cannot just be a sequence of approvals. It has to function as a living system of strategic intelligence. You can think of that system in 3 layers. First, how strategy is understood. Every organisation carries an underlying architecture, why it exists, where value is created, and what must hold true for it to function. Call this the strategic architecture, the conditions that must remain coherent for strategy to make sense at all. Second, how strategy is expressed. On top of that sits what the organisation is actually doing, the markets it is in, the activities it prioritises, the assets it builds, the initiatives it funds. This is the strategy in practice, the blueprint of current commitments. Third is how the organisation learns in motion. Between those two, reality has to speak. 4 elements matter. First is signals, what is changing and why it matters. Second is judgment, how those signals are interpreted. Third is ledger, what decisions are recorded. And fourth is pulse, how that meaning is communicated. Together, these form a simple but powerful system, a way of understanding what must hold, seeing how it is being expressed, detecting when it is starting to break, and deciding how to respond before that breakdown becomes irreversible. When these elements are weak or missing, governance defaults to something much simpler, protecting existing commitments and defending old plans. You can see the cost of that in banking automation. Early AI adoption looks like a success. Faster processes, lower costs, improved metrics. But beneath the surface, each decision hard codes an operating model. Customer segmentation, risk tolerance, decision authority. By the time second-order effects appear, flexibility is already gone. From the CFO's perspective, the issue is not whether automation was correct. It was whether the organisation had a system that allowed assumptions to be tested, signals to be observed, decisions to be revisited. Without that system, strategy locks in faster than learning can occur. For finance leaders, this is not philosophical, it is practical. Because capital is committed long before the future becomes clear. And the question is never whether the plan was correct. The question is whether it was judged responsibly when it became binding. The CFO does not choose the future, but the CFO determines when strategy becomes irreversible. That means you can shape the conditions under which judgment occurs. 3 moves matter. First move, make assumptions visible. Not more analysis, but clarity on what must be true, what is uncertain, and what signals would change the decision. Second is reserve room to change your mind. Hold back some capital not for efficiency, but for learning, reversibility, and adaptation. And 3, create a rehearsal forum, a space where the organisation can test decisions before they become binding. This is a space where signals, ledger, and pulse come together, where judgment can play out without the cost of commitment. When governance works this way, you are no longer asking strategy to be right in advance. You are asking the system to remain judgeable as conditions change. This is the shift from strategy as a document to strategy as a continuously tested and expressed set of assumptions. From governance as control to governance as a system that allows organisations to change their mind in time. Strategy does not need better timelines. It does not need more detailed plans. It needs systems that keep judgment alive as conditions change. Because in the end, strategy does not fail when the future is unclear. Strategy fails when organisations lose the ability to recognise that it is changing and to respond before commitment makes that recognition too expensive. Strategy is not defined by time horizons. It is defined by the coherence of its assumptions under change.